statistics. And therefore, it is a combination of everybody producing the right recipe for children.
All right. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Professor. That's Professor J.S. Bamra from the BMA. James Barge is Public Policy Director at ISBA, which represents the UK advertising industry. James, very good evening to you. Now, I imagine you're none too happy about this.
Hi, Ian. Look, advertisers agree. I think it's really important to state up front that, of course, Britain has an obesity problem and that action must be taken. But at the same time, we expect that policy to be well evidenced and actually deliver an improvement to children's health. And we simply don't see that with regard to this. Instead, we see a policy that's ignored technological advancements and will significantly harm UK business at a time when we all want the economy to recover in a serious fashion.
I presume this would need primary legislation to happen. Obviously, there are going to be interests that lobby the government to go much further than they've said they're intending to go today. And as we heard there from the BMA, they want a ban on online advertising as well, which has become a massive thing, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's two things here. There's a 9 p.m. watershed for TV and then a ban on paid for advertising online. Both are poorly evidenced. Let's not lose sight of that. You're right to say I'm sure that the BMA and others will be pushing for further action. As an industry, we've made the case now for months that there are far more proportionate ways for government to deliver exactly what it wants to deliver when it comes to protecting children, particularly in the online space. But they need to work with industry to deliver them. And those tools, those technological tools to deliver protections exist right now, don't require primary legislation, and certainly would be cheaper to the taxpayer to implement.
It's quite a difficult one, though, for your sector, isn't it? Because when we hear arguments, and I'm not saying that Professor Basra put it like this, but when you hear adverts which effectively amount to, oh, just think of the children, it's quite difficult to counter that with just hard facts, isn't it?
Well, I think, look, the case you made is a really important one here. I heard two arguments coming from the professor just now. One is that children are drawn towards cheaper food, and then an argument around adult obesity levels. Look, there is a role for parenting here, and as advertisers and manufacturers, my members work to support healthier choices and create a more informed consumers. Now, that's a really strong message. Now, when it comes to protecting children beyond that, we need to understand the drivers of obesity in this country and work collectively to help address them. Levels of activity, intervention in schools, education programs, all of those are very easily agreeable amongst different pockets of stakeholders, and government needs to focus more on delivering them.
James, thank you very much. That's James Barge, Public Policy Director at ISBA. Now, Britney Spears has made rare public remarks on what she calls the abusive conservatorship she's lived under for 13 years. Britney's father was granted control over her affairs by a court order after concerns over her mental health in 2008. Liz Day is one of the producers of the Framing Britney Spears documentary.
I was completely shocked by Britney's speech yesterday in court, and I'm still shocked. She said so many blockbuster bombshells. She said, I just want my life back. I truly believe this conservatorship is abusive. My dad and anyone involved should be in jail. I shouldn't be in a conservatorship if I can work and provide money and work for myself and pay other people. It makes no sense. I deserve to have the same rights as anybody does.
Well, Britney alleges she was denied the right to have more children and was put on psychiatric drugs against her wishes. Well, Dr. Anne Olivarius is the chair and senior partner of the law firm McAllister Olivarius, who regularly works with victims of abuse, and she joins us now. And I have to say, I'd never heard of this word conservatorship. And listening to what Britney Spears was saying yesterday, or reading her words, it seems to be the most horrific thing. That I can't understand how something like that can happen in a democratic society which respects the rule of law.
Britney Spears' case is so unusual. It is a huge stain of embarrassment on the American judicial system. It really is a human rights violation of high order. Our firm has dealt with people who have needed to be in conservatorships, but these are people who are in a coma, who are desperately ill or have fragile X syndrome or some kind of condition where they simply cannot take care of themselves and they need to be taken care of by someone else. But, this is something that can be permanent, but only in those circumstances. In her case, she is, paying huge amounts of money, over $1 million a year, to support her family, other people. She's out there performing and doing a magnificent job by many people's accounts. It makes no sense that she should have to be under the guidance of her father. And of course, one has to wonder why her father, why not her mother or other people or some other independent source. None of it makes any sense. It is clearly a political maneuvering. It is wrong morally, legally, ethically, and this needs to stop.
So what happens now? She's made her statement. What's the process now?
The process is that she now has to apply formally to be relieved from the conservatorship. And I think she's in the process of doing that. She's claiming she doesn't have legal counsel who has been effective for her, and that's quite surprising and sad. She needs to have somebody who can give her a legal voice. The judge, I just read her testimony a few hours ago. The judge listened, it seemed, pretty intently, and it looked like that what she had to say was really relatively so articulate, particularly for someone in a conservatorship who should actually be unable to speak to the world, who should be unable to cope with reality. Britney Spears is not that person, and she's able, obviously, to handle her life. Why do they have her out there working? She's like a slave to her family and the situation she's in. And of course, once you're in a conservatorship, as the Bessemer Trust, if any of these people are involved, they've got no reason to let her out because they're making a lot of money by locking her up. And she really is enslaved. It is a massive human rights violation.
Well, that's what it would seem to be to me as well. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. That's Dr. Anne Olivarius, the chair and senior partner of the law firm McAllister Olivarius. Well, coming up in a moment, it's the State of London with the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and our very own James O'Brien. But first, it's time for the news on LBC at 7:30 with Thomas Watts.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
The Northern Ireland Executive has announced a series of changes to the traffic light system for foreign travel. Several popular destinations have been added to the green list, including Ibiza, Menorca and Mallorca, allowing holidaymakers to return without going into quarantine. The lists are expected to apply across the UK, but we're awaiting confirmation from the governments in England, Wales and Scotland. An audit has found hundreds of women have been wrongly missed by the cervical cancer screening programme in Scotland. One of those wrongly excluded went on to die from cervical cancer. Around 430 women who'd had partial hysterectomies are to be offered fast-track appointments following an urgent review. And the Prime Minister says new rules on junk food advertising will help tackle a national struggle with obesity. Restrictions include a ban on TV adverts for products high in sugar, salt and fat before the 9 o'clock watershed. The weather, widespread rain this evening, dry in Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. Some strong winds developing in northern parts of the UK. A low of 9 Celsius.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. State of London debate, live from Westminster with Mayor of London Sadiq Khan and James O'Brien.
Hello, good evening and welcome to the State of London Mayoral Debate 2021. I'm James O'Brien. I'm up way past my bedtime. I'm about to introduce you to the Mayor of London, who will be here for an hour and a half to take all your questions. It's an opportunity to help shape London's policies, and you can submit any questions that you may have via the Mayor of London's website or go to lbc.co.uk to find the link. We've divided topics into 5 sections: transport, housing, safety, the environment and London's hoped for economic recovery. And tonight is your chance to put your issues to the person responsible. You can join our live virtual audience on the Global Player. You can see me in glorious Technicolor and the Mayor and no fewer than 9 deputy mayors. And you can also follow proceedings at the GLA, the Greater London Authority's YouTube channel. Sadiq Khan, welcome.
Great to be here, James. Looking forward to another State of London debate with my fantastic deputy mayors as well.
Yeah, all 9 of them.
Well, you know, the great thing about these debates is we get to hear from Londoners, and I'm really keen for them to hear from the men and women doing the hard yards.
By the time I finish introducing them, it'll be almost time to go home. You realise that, don't you? But nonetheless, I will do it. Joanne McCartney is the Deputy with responsibility for education and childcare. Jules Pipe covers planning, regeneration and skills. It's like celebrity squares on the screen up there with all 9 faces. I'm expecting them to wave. Justine Simons takes care of culture and creative industries. Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard, communities and social justice. Rajesh Agrawal is the Deputy Mayor with responsibility for business. Shirley Rodriguez for environment and energy. Sophie Linden, the Deputy Mayor with responsibility for policing and crime. Heidi Alexander, transport and Deputy Chair of TfL. And Tom Copley, the Deputy Mayor with responsibility for housing and residential development. What's top of the list at the moment for you? What's top of the to-do list?
The key thing is the recovery this summer. We've had an awful 15, 16 months. Almost 20,000 Londoners have lost their lives. That's 20,000 bereaved families. But also we've had more than 300,000 Londoners who've lost their jobs with, on the horizon, 1 million or so furloughed Londoners. The key thing this summer has got to be a rapid recovery, and that's why we've launched the biggest domestic tourism campaign our city's ever seen. Let's Do London. We're encouraging Londoners to come back to the West End, those across the country to come to London safely to support our economy.
It didn't go that well last week, did it, with the Scottish football fans? The numbers in Scotland of infections have possibly reflected that free-for-all in Leicester Square, and it was also quite a frightening experience for many Londoners. Whose fault was that? Well,
to be fair to Scottish men and women who came down, fewer came down than we'd originally feared. But it's always envisaged that you'd have tens and thousands of Scottish fans coming down to watch the old classic England versus Scotland. I've got to say, by and large, the Scottish fans behaved really well. The concern, as I said, in advance of them coming down was inadvertently catching the virus or passing it on. So my advice to them after we saw the mingling and mixing in Leicester Square was to make sure they get tested, because some of them may have caught the virus or even worse, passed it on.
So that was baked in, was it? That you were expecting those scenes in Leicester Square? I mean, astonishing cheek-by-jowl gatherings, people sort of surfing on the pavement at one point with their tops off on their bellies. You were expecting those sort of scenes, those sort of figures, those sort of numbers?
I think if you speak to the Scottish FA, the Scottish Government, the English FA, those who've got experience of previous England-Scotland games, there have been far more challenges previously than this time. Listen, none of us wanted the numbers of people coming down for obvious reasons in the middle of a pandemic. But I'm relieved that actually we didn't have the levels of antisocial behaviour and criminality that some predicted. And I want to thank all those Scottish fans who did behave well.
Speaking of tourism, do you know what the score is at the moment? Green lists being announced, people probably less likely to want to come here at the moment given our problems with the Delta virus and the fact that they'll be likely coming from countries that aren't as quite as far down the vaccination route as we are. What sort of scenario can you describe for business owners in this city who rely upon tourism for their livelihoods?
Just to give you listeners an idea of the impact on our economy. International tourists not coming last year cost our economy about £7.5 billion. Domestic tourists not coming to London cost our economy about £3.5 billion. I think this summer we're going to be realistic. We don't think there'll be many long-haul passengers coming to London, the international tourists. And that's why my message to Londoners who've not been to the West End recently, or those around the country listening to LBC digitally, is this may be your one summer where you can come to London and not be competing with international tourists to queue for the V&A or the British Museum or theatres.
Are you advertising? Are you advertising on sort of Anglia TV and Central? Are you trying to encourage non-Londoners to come to town?
Yeah, we are. We've spent millions of pounds advertising across the country. I want to thank all the London attractions, the museums, the business improvement districts, the councils working with us. We've launched the biggest advertising campaign ever. It's north of £7 million, and we'll continue to advertise our great city so people can come safely, which will help jobs in particular in retail, hospitality and culture, protect jobs, help the creation of new jobs, and hopefully attract people back to London who may have returned to home of mum and dad or to country of origin if they're EU citizens.
Don't know why I mentioned television stations. Everybody knows that radio is by far the most effective place to advertise. And of course, I think there was Global has by far the most effective stable in that field. But I shall leave that for your bean counters to address. Shall we kick things off? I just want to say, We normally do this at the O2. It's the nearest you and I will ever get to feeling like rock stars, walking out onto that stage. Not exactly to tumultuous applause and cheers or anything like that.
Speak for yourself, mate. I am.
I'm speaking for you as well. There was one year in particular where things got a tiny bit hairy, but we are in a sort of hermetically sealed studio today, and your deputies are therefore even more isolated from you than they are when they're sitting a few feet away on the stage. If I have any notes from the last time we did this, which feels like 100 years ago, they may be that we didn't get the deputies involved quite as much as we might have liked to. Obviously, that now becomes even bigger challenge, given that there are 9 of them. But I just would bring that to your attention. Do feel free to pull them in as and when you please, if that's all right. And I think now we will take our first question, which is from Cesare, who is here from Kensington and Chelsea. Cesare, good evening.
Good evening to everybody. I should explain myself first. I'm Polish by birth, which is quite relevant these days. 40 years in London, Notting Hill. 42 years international experience as an award-winning architect. I experienced Livingston's Western Congestion Zone extension with the residents' discount. Transportation was my passion. I did studies for the Cross River Tram. I did studies for the Highways Agency. At present, I'm giving shape to my PhD to be done at the UCL, delayed by COVID, on the urban and quality of life outcomes of free public transport in cities. Now, to the question. I'm 68. I live in the RBKC. I drive, I cycle, I ride a motorbike, I walk and use public transport.
Not at the same time.
My question relates to the way that ULEZ is being introduced. Reducing pollution is critical, but the way the ULEZ extension has been set up looks socially divisive. It will hit most those that cannot afford to upgrade their cars and those who use their cars little, just like I do. Wealthy drivers would not be bothered by the £15 per day charge and will carry on driving their tractors days in and out, or drive their Teslas and other expensive electric cars. I have a car that I drive twice a week or so, short distances, one for shopping. It would cost me £30 a week to use my car. A driver that drives for several hours every day will also pay £15 per day. How is this blanket social injustice going to be addressed?
I mean, he's right, isn't he? It's simply not fair.
Well, look, thank you for your question. You're a Londoner, by the way. It doesn't matter if you're born in Poland or not. I'll bring in Heidi Alexander shortly, but the short answer is this, for me, is an issue of social justice. When you look at the impact of the poor quality of air in our city, children, as a consequence, the poorest children have stunted lungs forever. Adults have a whole host of health issues, from asthma to cancer to heart disease, caused directly because of the poor quality air. Because of the ultra-low emission zone, already we've seen the toxic air in our city reduced by just below a half, and across the rest of our city by more than a third. And I think the rest of the Londoners should benefit from the ultra-low emission zone, which is why we intend to expand it this October. I'll let Heidi explain, James, some of the issues raised about the so-called unfairness with the ultra-low emission zone.
Before you do, Heidi, I noticed in the Evening Standard last night you told Londoners whose cars will breach the ULEZ rule that they should consider trading them in for a newer model. I think that possibly adds to Cesare's worries about social division, and it casts you in the role of a latter-day Marie Antoinette, doesn't it?
Well, what I said, the full answer, rather than the 2 sentences that you quoted, was what we've done is, in the absence of the government supporting a national diesel scrappage scheme, from TfL's own budgets, got a £56 million scrappage scheme that has helped more than 10,000 cars be scrapped, which enables people to make the conversion. There is still money set aside for those who are low income, those who are disabled, and those charities. But the point I was making in response to an assertion was, would people have to buy a new car north of £25,000? And the point I was making was, actually, for your car to be compliant, it just needs to be Euro 6 if it's a diesel car, or a Euro 4 if it's a petrol car, and many second-hand cars are Euro 6 compliant and Euro 4.
You're still telling people to go out and buy a new car, new for them, not brand new, but...
Oh, no, I'm not. What I'm actually doing is encouraging people to walk, cycle, or use public transport. And if they've got to use a car, to use a compliant car. The great news, James, is as a consequence of our policies, there are now 87% of cars that go through the ULEZ are compliant, which has led to the sort of improvements in toxic air that I'm talking about: reduction in nitrogen oxide, reduction in reduction in particulate matters, less carbon emissions.
Heidi Alexander, I mean, you can't get away from the fact, can you, that it hits people a lot harder according to how fat their bank balances are?
So I think one of the things we probably do need to remember, James, is that in London, you're more likely to own a car the wealthier you are. And so if you look at the expanded ultra-low emission zone that will be coming in October, 6 in 10 households don't have access to a car in that expanded area. And in London as a whole, about half of Londoners don't have access to a car. And so I think the point that Sadiq made earlier, which is at the moment we've got a situation where the poorest people who own the fewest cars have actually got the dirtiest air at the moment. And so I think this is a social justice issue. The scrappage scheme that Sadiq talked about as well is still open for Londoners who are on low incomes or who are disabled. They can apply to that scrappage scheme. They can get a £2,000 payment, which they can put towards purchasing a second-hand petrol car. I can't remember whether Sadiq said earlier, most petrol cars that have been manufactured since 2005 are compliant with the ULEZ standards. So if you actually think about what's going to be happening in October, 4 out of 5 of the cars that are going to be driving in the ultra-low emission zone when it's expanded out to the North and South Circular will already be compliant. And that scrappage scheme is really important for low-income Londoners who can apply to get that £2,000 payment, and those who have got disabilities who are also eligible.
So if I've understood you correctly, the problem is real. I didn't know that 6 in 10 figure of households with access to a car. The problem is real, but the number of people who are going to be directly hit by this particular unfairness is small enough for you to think that it's a kind of price worth paying for the bigger win?
I think we've got to clean up London's air.
It's a yes or no, I think, Heidi. No pressure.
I don't think it's right that it should only be people in central London that have the privilege of clean air. I think people across the whole of London should have.
So it's a yes?
Look, we've got to make sure we clean up the air in our city.
Yeah, but the people that Cesare has identified, and the statistics are compelling. I just want to be absolutely clear.
Oh, yeah.
What you're saying to him is, you're absolutely right. It does discriminate against poorer people who need to use a car and can't currently afford to get the kind of car that would be compliant. But the numbers are sufficiently small and the target is sufficiently important that we are prepared to absorb that reality. I'm just describing what you've said.
Well, there are balancing and competing interests.
And that's the balance that you've done.
Yeah. One of the reasons we're lobbying the government for more support with a national targeted scrappage scheme is to help more people like Cesare.
I see. We'll move on, I think, to another question. Caroline in Lambeth is on the line. Thank you, Heidi. I hope we see you again, although, as I've mentioned a few times now, there are so many deputy mayors lined up that it's like a Cecil B. DeMille production. Caroline in Lambeth, welcome to our high-tech studio. What would you like to ask the mayor or indeed his various deputies? And there's our first technical issue of the evening. Caroline, I don't know why I can't hear you. We shall try and fix that in a moment, but it's possibly your fault. We've all done this over the course of the last 18 months. Are you on mute by any chance,
No.
Caroline? Oh,
No.
I can hear you now. Quick, ask the question before it goes down again.
It moves away from cars a bit, and I'm of Polish extraction as well. So, so my question is, what is going to be done to continue to address transport safety for pedestrians, which is increasingly compromised, especially for older children and less able pedestrians, with all the delivery motorcycles, cycles, motorised scooters, roller skaters, skateboarders on pavements and in pedestrianised areas. Many of these modes of transport also weave in and out of traffic on roads. I've even seen scooters on the underground, scooting along platforms. There is no regulation, and the culture of abuse of pedestrian spaces is increasing.
These e-scooters are obviously an issue that all politicians are going to have to address. Can I add something to Caroline's question, if I may? In my neck of the woods, in Chiswick, they're reopening one of the areas that had been pedestrianised on Devonshire Road, and some of us are happy about that, some of us are unhappy. But someone else pointed out to me that these increasing pedestrianisation areas, where we've got tables and chairs on pavements and things like that, not just difficult for pedestrians, but particularly difficult for wheelchairs. So what's on your to-do list in this field?
Well, Caroline, I want to encourage more Londoners to walk, cycle and or use public transport. And one of the things that we've sought to do over the last 5 years is to make our roads and pavements, by the way, more safer. E-scooters are unlawful. The only places where they're allowed is if you hire them from one of our pilot companies in 5 boroughs across London. We've working with the police, British Transport Police as well, to enforce the issue of e-scooters breaking the law and causing discomfort and sometimes personal injury to people like yourself. In relation to what James alluded to, look, the issue of low traffic neighbourhoods and safer streets have been around for decades. What we've sought to do, and I hate to use the word opportunity when it comes to a pandemic, is to use the opportunity of this pandemic, working with the government to support councils to roll out even more low traffic neighbourhoods and safer streets. And the evidence is having more walking and more cycling benefits small businesses, but you're right to highlight one of the unintended consequences. It can make it more difficult for those who are visually impaired or those who are on wheelchairs. And what we've sought to do is make sure we engage, listen and work with not just disabled individuals, but disabled groups to make sure we address the legitimate concerns they have. For example, the island bus stops you may have seen, James, across London, which can cause an issue. And so we're hoping that we learn along the process to address the concerns not unreasonably some Londoners have about some of the progress we're trying to make.
So again, to Pracy, it's a work in progress, and you acknowledge that some of the current scenarios are not, but they are, I think the phrase of the year is suboptimal, so you will be looking to improve them. I'm always conscious of being hyper-local, but this is a State of London debate, so I make no apology for it on this occasion.
I'll just say this
the street I just referred to, it's not just in my neck of the woods that this is happening. How do you personally feel when borough councils or local councils reverse these schemes after a year of them having time to bed in, and then for political reasons sometimes they just press rewind and go back to exactly how things were before?
Look, I think Heidi talks about the importance of this as an issue of social justice. I believe politicians should show leadership as well as sometimes fellowship, and this is a good example where actually it's worth making the argument to residents, making the changes if you need to do so, and businesses to address their concerns. I just make this point in a gentle way to those politicians who are a bit nervous in advance of council elections next May. On the ballot paper in the May just gone was the issue of active travel, walking and cycling, investing in low traffic neighbourhoods, investing in safer streets, investing in cleaning up our air, and I secured the biggest vote of a sitting mayor. So what I say to councils is be a bit brave, address the concerns people have that are legitimate, and you've seen in boroughs like Waltham Forest, businesses benefiting, residents who are offside now onside, and parents loving it, walking, scootering, cycling to school.
This is one of those areas where politics veers worryingly close to the traditional radio phone-in, I think, because the loudest voices, the angriest voices are often the ones that are heard the most. If I'm reading between the lines of what you say, you think that perhaps some councillors worried about re-election are reacting to the scale of angry protest rather than perhaps taking a step back and trying to assess the broader public view. We get posters around our way, which very quietly and politely say, well, we rather like the low traffic neighbourhoods, actually, words to that effect, whereas the people on the other side of the argument are the ones that are out there with loud hailers and rattles.
I was advised by commentators and others in advance of May the 6th to listen to the vocal minority, in my view, objecting to some of our bold policies around transport. Lo and behold, the silent majority returned at me in record numbers.
You don't know for sure. I mean, they may...
Well, I do, because I raised it on regular occasions when it came to hustings, when it came to debates, when it came to my literature. And I took on those who are criticising us, and you'll be aware, we've discussed it on many occasions on Speak to Sadiq, this issue. And, I think some of this is to explain some of the challenges we face. We are a global city that's ostensibly a Roman town that's been expanded over various centuries. And we've got to address a real issue of both the climate emergency, poor quality air, by finite space. What we can't do is replace one crisis, a COVID crisis, with another one caused by poor quality air and cars.
Did you promise before the election that TfL private hire drivers would see the congestion charge back to 6:30 in the evening?
Now, what I said we'd do is negotiate with the government to allow us to have autonomy about what the C charge should be, rather than the government imposing a situation where we've got to have it 7 days a week from 7 a.m. till 10 p.m. And what I'm hoping to do over the course of the next year is to work with the TfL to bring forward our proposals for what the C charge should be, rather than what the government tells us it should be.
Okay, that was a question from Abdul in Enfield. Rosemary in Ealing has been shielding now for the best part of 18 months. Straight up, she wants to know, is it safe to get back on public transport?
Yeah, I've just used public transport to come here. We have world-class enhanced cleaning, hospital quality disinfectant. On my journey here, I saw everyone wearing a face mask. We've got more enforcement taking place. The only thing I say in a gentle way is, if it's possible, avoid the rush hour. Because that means that you're not inadvertently breaching social distance. Roughly speaking, try not to travel between 5 and 6:30 p.m. and between 7 and 8:30 in the morning.
And Sardar in Southwark wants to know whether the 60-plus Oyster card and Freedom Pass is going to be stopped at all in the foreseeable future, or is that here for the long haul? Or is that an autonomy issue as well?
It almost happened last year.
Yes.
One of the things the government said to me was take away free travel for under 18s, take away free travel for over 60s. I said no. Lots of pressure to do so. As long as I'm mayor,
why do you think they were doing that, Mayor Khan?
Because there was an election coming up, and they thought they could, pin some things on me, and tell Londoners that it was down to me rather than conditions imposed by them. I'm hoping, though, now the election's out of the way, we can have a grown-up relationship. I'm keen to build bridges with the government. I'm working really closely on the vaccines rollout. I've got a summit tomorrow with Nadeem Zahawi, who I think has been fantastic as a team player. The Prime Minister's recorded a statement for our summit tomorrow, and Matt Hancock's supporting us as well. So look, I'm keen to put the election behind us and the silly political games behind us and work with the government for the good of our city and our country.
They're not here to challenge that, so I will. I mean, there are huge holes in TfL's finances, and they'll be keen to fill them. But you mentioned building bridges with the government. Do you think Hammersmith Bridge also got perhaps politicised unduly in the run-up to the mayoral election?
Well, Londoners can go to social media and see videos recorded by Tory ministers, Tory Secretary of State, Tory MPs, Tory candidates to be the mayor, promises all sorts of things. Where are they? And I want to say to the government in a polite, courteous way is work with the council, work with us to get this bridge opened sooner rather than later. There is some good news, though, which is the task force that Heidi sits on with the government minister is looking at whether the casing around the pedestal is sufficiently safe to allow the reopening for pedestrians and cyclists sooner than expected, which is potential good news for those residents who've been suffering for the last 2 years plus.
Particularly children, actually.
Absolutely.
Cycling and walking to and from school.
Absolutely.
At the moment,
Absolutely.
to do a mini marathon. Let's move on now to safety and policing. And we will begin, I think, with a question from Althea, who is in Waltham Forest. Althea, good evening. What would you like to ask the Mayor?
Good evening. I'd like to ask, what can you do to help London become an anti-racist city and more equitable for all?
Is it? I mean, you're how old are you now? You're in your mid-40s?
I'm 50 going on 25.
Yeah, all right. What's it like compared to when you were a kid? Over the course of those 50 years in London, I mean, the booing of footballers taking the knee, things. Where would you put it on the scale? Where would you put 2021 on that scale going back to 1971?
Yeah, so I think it's possible, and this refers to this question, it's possible to say there's been huge progress made since I was growing up. When my dad first arrived, there were signs saying no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. And by blacks, they meant any person of colour. When I was growing up, me and my mates were often called the P word or the N word. And my children who grew up in the same area have not had that experience. Progress made, yes. But is it the case that we are now a country that is equal, that is fair, where there isn't racism? No. And why Althea's question is so important is I passionately believe, and I'll bring in Dr. Debbie Wicks-Bernard, who's my deputy mayor who does social justice, is it's not enough, Althea, not to be racist. I think we should strive to be anti-racist, to address the issue of racism, discrimination, bias that still exists in the most progressive city in the world in 2021, as illustrated by the fact that although the vast majority of us applauded our brilliant players taking the knee, there was a small minority booing, and we know the experience of Marcus Rashford, Raheem Sterling, myself, and many other people of colour, and that's why Althea, we should strive to be even better. Although James is spot on, we must recognise the massive progress made. Look at Rishi Sunak, look at Sajid Javid, look at Kwasi, look at Priti Patel. These are people of colour in the cabinet, but we shouldn't pretend things are perfect. We shouldn't pretend there aren't serious problems.
But there are people of colour in the cabinet, but they're also key players in what have become known as culture wars, which often seem, to me at least, designed to set things back a bit, to set back some of the progress that you've just described.
Yeah, I saw a great discussion on Ian Dale's Crosstalk the other day on this very issue. I think it was yesterday. I'm very nervous about people trying to garner support, to build a career, to get votes, to divide communities. it's really easy actually to play in people's fears to build a career, whatever field you do. And actually, I think it's really important. And recently, without being too pious or sanctimonious about it, we recently commemorated Jo Cox's the death. It's been 5 years since Jo passed away. I think she was right in her maiden speech when she talked about focusing on the things that unite us rather than divide us. But Althea is right when she alludes to the fact that racism is a factor, not the only factor, is a factor why you see, for example, a large percentage of black children excluded from schools, not doing as well in exams, not getting the jobs they deserve, being underemployed. We saw what happened not just in George Floyd, but we got experience in this country. And so we shouldn't, in a sort of arrogant way, think, George Floyd was killed in Minnesota, Minneapolis, could never happen here. The actions taken by an American president when an NFL player takes the knee could never happen here. We've got to make sure we strive to be even better.
Sue Yee in Enfield, I'm going to come to you first after the looming 8 o'clock news bulletin, because your question is all the questions are important, but we have the pleasure of your company, so I don't want to cram you into the time remaining. I will instead read a question from Errol, who's in Greenwich and describes himself as a retired police officer. The Met Police is the biggest police service in the UK, given some of the recent bad publicity which the MPS has received recently. Is it now time to examine the breaking up of the Metropolitan Police Service, perhaps along the line drawn through London by the River Thames?
No.
Why not?
Look,
she's having a bit of a mare, isn't she? Pardon the pun, Cressida Dick.
We're a city of 10 million. We're a global city. We've got all sorts of international and national challenges. We've got, I think, 600 protests alone this year. We're also a target for terrorists. Rather than fragmenting our police service, we should be thinking about closer working with colleagues across the 43 police forces across the country. There is lots of
too big to fail, then.
No. That's the worst thing you can say. Look, the police have had serious issues with a number of
institutionally corrupt.
That's what the panel said in relation to the awful killing of Daniel Morgan.
No, the panel was investigating the awful killing of Daniel Morgan, but the description of the Met as being institutionally corrupt
came from the panel.
It came from the panel, but it wasn't just with reference to that particular investigation.
Oh, it was.
But they're talking about a corruption that remains, and this is decades after Daniel Morgan.
No, they're not.
Well, they are, because Cressida Dick still has questions to answer about why documents weren't handed over, why investigations were foiled, and why a lot of the personnel involved will still be in the force, not least some of the ones that had very dodgy connections with Rupert Murdoch.
It's not present tense, it's past tense, and we're going to be quite clear about certain things that aren't true. So the panel was quite clear in relation to their finding of institutional corruption, and that's got to be addressed. And what the Commission has been asked to do by the Home Secretary and myself is to respond to the serious failings identified by the panel. A number of failings by the Met Police Service, starting in 1987 up to a number of years ago, and we've got to make sure we earn the trust and confidence of those Londoners that we've lost because of the panel findings.
You are listening to the State of London debate with me, James O'Brien, Sadiq Khan and the Deputy Mayors. Don't forget you can watch us live if you're a glutton for punishment on the Global Player, and you can still register your question and the remaining hour on lbc.co.uk. You'll find a link to the Mayor of London's website. We will be back live from Westminster after the 8 o'clock headlines.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, I'm Serena Farrow. The government in the past half an hour has just announced they're adding Madeira, the Balearic Islands, several UK overseas territories and the Caribbean islands, including Barbados, to the green travel list. 6 countries, including Tunisia and Haiti, though, will be put on the red list. All the changes will come into effect from next Wednesday from 4 a.m. But the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, wants other European countries to follow her lead in placing quarantine requirements on British travellers to help tackle variants.
Even though there is reason to be hopeful, the pandemic isn't over. We need to remain vigilant. In particular, the newly arising variants, especially now the Delta variant, are a warning for us to be careful.
An audit's found hundreds of women have been wrongly missed by the cervical cancer screening programme in Scotland. One of those wrongly excluded went on to die from cervical cancer. Around 430 who'd had partial hysterectomies are to be offered fast-track appointments following an urgent review. Junk food TV adverts are going to be banned before the 9 o'clock watershed to try to tackle obesity, but companies will still be able to advertise their brands without showing food. And Lewis Hamilton's expressed concerns about plans to allow a capacity crowd into the British Grand Prix next month. Around 140,000 fans will be able to attend the race at Silvertown. It's all part of the test event scheme. The 7-time world champion says the decision feels a little premature, while COVID infections are still rising. From Global's newsroom, you're up to date.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. State of London debate, live from Westminster with Mayor of London Sadiq Khan and James O'Brien.
Hello and welcome back to the State of London debate. Although it does occur to me, debate may be something of a misnomer. I think if we do this again next year, I might retitle it the State of London Inquisition. Because there's not a great deal of opportunity for toing and froing with the people who are answering the questions. Although perhaps if we're back in the hall at the O2 Indigo, then we can reinstitute the debating terms. And we will. I'm not going to spoil or take up too much time, but we will have to have a conversation next time you're in my radio studio about whether or not that report was institutionally corrupt. Uses the verb was or is, because I'm still not convinced. But much more important than what I think is the question that Sue Yi in Enfield would like to ask you. Sue Yi, good evening. What would you like to ask Sadiq Khan?
Thanks, James. Good evening. Congratulations, Mr. Mayor, on your recent election.
Thanks.
There is a growing spate of violence, public disorder, gang culture, and knife crime, and crime in general. And it's clear that fresh thinking is needed to tackle these. Have you on your team got any fresh thoughts and realistic plans to keep Londoners safe as lockdown eases? Which will no doubt exacerbate the problem. Also, in light of numerous and constant accounts of young innocent black boys being targeted unfairly by police, would you agree that stop and search is a blunt, crass and counterproductive policing instrument?
Thanks for your question. You raised a number of issues. So we've got plans, particularly for this summer. You mentioned the easing of restrictions, and we are concerned because we're seeing it across the globe. As restrictions are eased, an increase in violent crime. Thankfully, during the pandemic, unlike other cities, Chicago and New York, we didn't see a big increase during the lockdown. So the fresh approach we're having this summer going forward is one where we use what's called a public health approach to make sure that we give young people constructive things to do. I'll mention your concerns around stop and search shortly. And we're investing record sums this summer to give young people constructive things to do, particularly in education, culture and sports, but also after schools, leading up to the summer holidays, weekends as well. At the same time, people will notice a high visibility police presence. We've got this new unit called the Violence Suppression Unit supporting the Violent Crime Task Force and the other teams we have across London, both in terms of the areas where we know from the data there are high levels of violent crime, habitual knife carriers and so forth, as well as other parts of London, particularly town centres where we are concerned. One of the tools the police will be using is intelligence-led stop and search. You're right.
Just remind us what that means, intelligence-led stop and search.
What it means is that police officers aren't allowed to use their prejudices to decide whether to stop and search somebody. There's got to be a good reason which can be objectively confirmed why they've decided to stop and search somebody. It's set out in the Police and Criminal Evidence Act.
Give us an example, because there are plenty of people, not least in my line of work, who think being black is a perfectly good reason to be stopped and searched, because they tell us of the disproportionate type of crime being committed by black people. Obviously, for the tape, they never then go on to explain why crimes disproportionately committed by white people should also see a similar sort of racial profiling. But that is, for many people, that is a reasonable ground. So that wouldn't be intelligence.
No. So the law's quite clear. You've got to have reasonable grounds and have reasonable suspicion before you can stop and search somebody. Being black or being in a group of people aren't reasonable grounds, isn't reasonable suspicion. In fact, I'll go further. If the sole reason is the smell of cannabis, which is sometimes used as proxy for what you're alluding to, that also has been criticised by the IAPC, by the College of Law, and the police won't use that as the sole reason for a stop and search. What we've done,
the police shouldn't use that as the sole reason for...
Correct. And the police, because of the biggest rollout of body-worn videos that we've ever seen since I became mayor, we now record the interactions. Why is that important? Because if you as a member of the public are concerned about the interaction, either the grounds for the stop and search or the interaction that took place, that's recorded now. It turns on automatically a few seconds before the interaction takes place. But we were concerned by the issues you've raised. I was concerned by the issue you raised about it being a blunt instrument leading to a lack of trust and confidence. So two of my deputy mayors, Debbie Weeks-Bernard and Sophie Linden, spent a lot of last summer. I was with them for some of it, going around communities in London, speaking to and listening to Black Londoners. And we're going to have an action plan to address these very points. And I'm happy for Sophie and Debbie to talk to you about some of the plans we've got to earn back the trust and confidence that, sadly, is lacking in too many Black Londoners.
Should we go to Sophie first? Sophie Linden, Deputy Mayor with responsibility for policing and crime.
Thanks a lot. Absolutely. I mean, I've spoken to many communities and many young Black men who have really voiced really serious concerns about the way in which they've been stopped and searched, and also the fact that they feel that they're unfairly targeted. And last summer, myself and Debbie spent a long time talking to communities and young Black men in particular about that. A couple of things they asked us to do that we are now doing. One was that the local police officers, when they come into the boroughs, when they start their training, that they should have community-led training, that they should have that the community should be training them on what the community is like and what it feels like to be policed, what it really feels like to be stopped and searched. Sadiq's put over £1 million a year into making sure that communities are going to be training new recruits and also training those officers coming into their local area. The second thing they asked for was much greater transparency, much greater view over the number of stops and searches. The ability to look at body-worn video to make sure that stop and search was done correctly. That is now happening in local groups, community monitoring groups. They are able to look at body-worn video and they're able to see whether right grounds, and your question, James.
But it's not working though, Sophie, is it? In the context of the number of deaths, I appreciate that there are other types of violent crime are down at the moment, but in the context of deaths, knife killings, whatever it is that you're doing isn't actually working.
I mean, the number of murders we've had this year, I mean, obviously it's very upsetting, it's worrying and concerning, it's just too many. And we have had too many teenagers murdered. There's 17 teenagers murdered so far this year already. But, we're really not complacent. Pre-COVID, we could see the figures coming down. We could see violence for under 25s coming down. There'd been a 25% reduction. We've got to make sure that coming out of COVID, we continue to bring down the violence and also make sure that the numbers of people being murdered. And we're doing that by what Sadiq talks about making sure there's things for young people to do, but also in supporting our police officers. There are more police officers out on the streets. Policing is part of the solution. It's not the whole solution. It's not going to make sure that we bring down violence and murder long term. And we're also really importantly, and talking about fresh ideas, Sadiq's put £6 million into 8 local areas of London where the community is leading that fight against violence. The community is taking control and the community is there finding the right solutions and working with the police.
But let me bring in briefly, if I may, Dr. Debbie Weeks-Bernard on this, who speaks for communities and social justice.
Thanks, James. I think what's also incredibly important to add to what both Sophie and Sadiq has said is that there's an awful lot of work that we need to do that's about preventing young people getting involved in violence in the first place and becoming at risk. And one of the areas of work that I have responsibility for is addressing the fact that there is a real lack of opportunities, particularly for young Black men who are aged between 16 to 24. And we're spending a great deal of time and a great deal of money trying to provide them with opportunities in some of those sectors in London that have got growth potential, so that we can give them work, so that we can give them training, so that we can give them something to aspire to and something that will enable them to move out of poverty and just really achieve their full potential. And I think that's some of the key ways that we can properly try to address this issue, which is around recognising that there's far too many young Black men who are unemployed in our city. They've got an unemployment rate of around 33%, which is in comparison to 13% for young white men. And what we need to do is we need to turn that around to enable them to effectively have things to do, but also have a way out of the situation in which many of them find themselves.
Did you notice, Sadiq Khan, during the worst months of the coronavirus crisis, that a possible solution to some of the rhetoric surrounding stop and search presented itself? Because aging white journalists were getting very, very angry about being stopped by police, or the prospect of being stopped by police, and asked whether or not they had any business being out doing whatever it was they were doing. I reckon if you kept that in place for another 6 months, then you'd probably quieten down a lot of the more excitable support for the practice that we're all so dismally familiar with.
I experienced this as an MP when a government member of the cabinet, the whip at the time, was walking through the gates of Downing Street, and the police had the temerity to ask him why he was there. And you'll remember who I'm talking about, a so-called plebgate. Yeah. And so it's, empathy is really important. It's really important, but actually walking in the shoes of others is equally important. And the experience Debbie's described of, young black Londoners feeling they've got a lack of opportunity, they're living in poverty, they've got no real hope, and then the interaction with the police being a negative one is a problem for all of us. And that's why the question is such an important question. And that's why Debbie, Sophie, the team, we're all working incredibly hard to give young people opportunities, but also to recognise the impact of stop and search if it's used badly.
People love the police until they're the ones being policed. A very wise policewoman caller to my programme said earlier this year. Lorraine in Greenwich wants to know what you're going to do to improve these dismal figures, if indeed it is within your power, these dismal figures for prosecutions and perhaps even more importantly convictions with regard to rape allegations.
Yeah, there are things we can do, and there are things we're doing to support the government. I was pleased, by the way, that the Home Sec and the Justice Sec did have the humility to apologise for the appalling way women in particular have been treated over the last
while also denying that it had anything to do with cuts to the justice system and the police.
In the end, the Justice Secretary did accept when he was asked questions by a journalist that cuts had a factor. In London, what we're doing, James, to support the criminal justice system is acting on the review undertaken by London's first ever Victims Commissioner, Claire Waxman, supporting victims and survivors, making sure they've got advisors to help them, making sure that the CPS act on the recommendations not to download all the stuff on the mobile phone, to improve the attrition rates. We're working with the government to try and address the backlog of cases. We need more Nightingale courts, we need longer sit-ins. And I think it's really important for us to realise there are currently cases listed for 2023 for a crime that occurred earlier on this year. So we can hardly be surprised when conviction rates are so low.
And quite a few people still keen, and again, this is going to be added to the list of questions that I ask you every time I see you. Ibrahim in Hillingdon leads the pack when he says, why are you so keen to back Cressida Dick when she has presided over so many serious failings?
Well, I think it's possible to have confidence in the top person in the job, the Commissioner, which I do, but to hold her to account often quite forcefully and have the checks and balances. That's what we want in a democracy. In a democracy, you want the police to be properly policed. And I can tell you this, no commissioner in London's history has been held to account the way this commissioner has. And I've experienced previous commissioners, not just the last one, but over the last 50 years as a Londoner. And whether it's the Home Secretary, whether it's myself, whether it's the police minister, whether it's the London Assembly, whether it's the Home Affairs Select Committee, whether it's journalists, whether it's Londoners, we hold her to account, but I've got confidence that she is the right person to act on some of the failings that have been highlighted over the last period.
Why?
Because she gets the importance of having a police service that has the trust and confidence in Londoners, because she understands that she's going to be held accountable to not just politicians, but to the members of the public, because she believes that we've got the best police service in the world, as indeed I do, because you've got some of these solutions in relation to fighting the increase in violent crime we've seen since 2013, not 2017 when she became the commissioner, and we're working together, as Sophie Lennon said, before the pandemic, reducing the numbers of homicides, reducing the numbers of youth violence crime, reducing the numbers of under 25 who'd been the victims of violent crime, reducing moped-enabled crimes, reducing burglary, at the same time increasing the number of people joining the police service, particularly from black, Asian, Maori-ethnic communities, and particularly women.
There is no news bulletin at 8:30, so I think I'll share with everybody listening or indeed watching that while we have been on air, the green list has been expanded for English tourists, so and of course for people who want to visit their families in the relevant places, the Balearic Islands, so that is Mallorca, Minorca, Ibiza and,
Mallorca?
No, for Montero? Malta, Madeira, and some islands in the Caribbean, including Barbados, have been added to England's travel green list. Move on now to air quality and environment, which we've touched on as well. So, before we go to Marisa and Haringey for the first question on this, it's clearly a proper passion of yours, this, both politically and personally, because as you've told us, you've had sort of late life diagnosis of asthma yourself, which you believe and the evidence suggests is linked to the quality of the air that we're breathing. And you talk about how your recent re-election is somehow a vindication of your policies on this particular issue. I expressed some scepticism about how you can separate the things that people liked from the things that people didn't like, or the people that voted for you because they didn't like the cut of anybody else's jib. But I take your point. Is it one of the hardest things to persuade people about? Because it's invisible, because it's about the future. It's not about pounds in their pocket. It's not about the ease with which they can cruise through the city or even their immediate personal safety. It's a sort of invisible enemy with an invisible solution, which is not really the friend of short-term politicking.
But in the 1950s, you could see the smog. You could see the consequence of having power stations in the heart of our city. I think you've articulated the problem with this current crisis. You can't see it, it's invisible. If there were spots on our skin because of the impact of toxic air, you'd see it. You speak to Ella's mum, right? You speak to the consultant paediatrician treating asthma that I met last week at the Royal Free. You speak to some of the people affected by not just asthma, heart disease, cancer and dementia, but then you listen to experts at Imperial College who said last year 4,000 people died prematurely because of the poor quality air. And then you join the dots between the climate emergency, poor quality air, nature, waste, the ocean, the rivers, and all the dots join up. And I think this is the most profound issue for our generation. And we've got a choice, James. I genuinely believe this. We can be the first generation to get it with proper solutions, or the last not to get it. And I want to be the first generation to get it with solutions. And you know what? Just in the last 5 years, according to Gary Fuller, one of the world's leading experts, he's seen more progress than in the previous 28 years he's been practicing as an expert in this area because of our policies. So it's also a good example of those cynics who say politicians can make no difference, working with Mums for Lungs, civic society, environmentalists, and I'm a great Deputy Mayor, Shirley Rodriguez. We're making change that I think will be permanent in our city and our country. And you know what else? I speak to mayors across the globe who look upon us with envy at the progress we're making.
To that end, let's go to Marisa, who is in Haringey. Marisa, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Yes, hi there. Well, actually, the Mayor has sort of preempted me to an extent by mentioning Ella's mum. I'm extremely concerned about the LTNs that have been imposed on Londoners in particular. I know they're all over the country, but we're talking about London. And I was interested to read today that actually Ella's mum herself is concerned in her own borough, Lewisham, about the increase in the traffic surge on the South Circular that's caused tremendous bottlenecking of traffic and as a consequence has actually increased the pollution in her area. It's also divided the Hither Green areas into east and west. It seems extremely divisive. It seems classist. The other thing that I found reading about the LTNs, and bearing in mind, I'm not actually personally affected by an LTN, but I'm a born and bred Londoner, so it does definitely concern me, is that by your own admission in the Made for TfL website, it states that the LTNs were brought in as a temporary measure during the COVID, the initial stages of COVID. The government pumped a lot of money into this, offered a lot of subsidies to councils, which of course have been taken up. And if they're temporary, will they be removed after the lockdown is finished? Because there's been no consultation in most cases as to whether or not these are actually legal. There's a case coming against them from Hackney on the 30th. And it's been extremely divisive to...
And it is, as you will know, splitting communities. Just for the benefit of people who perhaps don't know, and I'm sure there aren't many, but when we talk about Ella and Ella's mum, we're talking about Ella Adu-Kissi Deborah, who lived near the South Circular Road in Lewisham and died in 2013. She became, I think, the first person in the country for whom an inquest found air pollution had made a material contribution to her death. Sadiq Khan, perhaps will involve Shirley Rodriguez in this part of the programme as well.
Yeah, and just look, I mean, in relation to the low traffic neighbourhoods, the councils have agreed, you're spot on to some extent, that they won't be made permanent until there's been proper consultation. So hopefully that reassures you in relation to councils consulting residents.
That's why there are plant pots and plastic barriers everywhere, so that it would be easier to take them out than to...
They're inexpensive, they're aesthetically displeasing, but that's the reason why.
Okay.
But actually, the question that this goes to is actually quite an important one. Do we want vehicles using side roads as rat runs, or do we want vehicles on the main road? And separately, do we want to clean the emissions from the main road by, for example, expanding the ultra-low emission zone that we're seeking to do? Let me give you one example before I bring in Shirley of the difference we've made. Because of my policies of making all our buses, more than 9,000, ULEZ compliant, electric, hydrogen or hybrid, we've reduced by more than 90% the emissions from our buses of nitrogen dioxide. So the main road is less polluting now than it was before. By expanding the ULEZ, the main roads will be even cleaner than they are now. But, Shirley can talk more about the evidence we've got and why LTNs are so important, but they're part of a package of measures. By themselves, not enough, but part of a package of measures to avoid a car-led recovery.
Can you address, or perhaps Shirley can, the statement by Marisa that Ella's mum Rosamond has found pollution to be getting worse where they are in the next few minutes. But before we do that, you talk about the temporary nature of it, where, again, I'm going to draw on my neck of the woods, where the cameras are there. They feel a bit more permanent than a plastic bollard. So, I get my number plate flashed and a fine through my letterbox if I use a route I've been using since I moved there. Is that temporary as well, potentially? The cameras are temporary as well?
You mean a rat run?
Well, you call it a rat run. It's A to B. Road. It's the quickest way to get...
It's a side road. So look, let's be clear. Let's talk about this. Okay. You're using a side road because it's quicker than using the main road.
Right. I'm using... Yeah, but I can't. I mean, listen, let's
be frank, James.
I don't want to draw a picture of my house. You can't get to my house without using a side road.
That's the conversation.
And I know that they've been almost randomly selected because I go down a different side road from the one that I went down before.
Let's talk about this.
This is your life. The question actually is about whether or not the cameras are evidence that perhaps things are a little bit more permanent than you just suggested.
No, the LTNs are temporary and to this consultation, but Waltham Forest is a really good case study, James. I mean, I was being facetious just because I was. Because in Waltham Forest, they realised, James, and this is the serious point, that when they first began down this road about 5-6 years ago, it was then called Mini Hollands. And we supported them when I first got elected. Lots and lots of objections from residents, particularly, actually, parents dropping children off to school.
Yes, that's right.
The residents whose roads were being used to go from A to B quicker were very happy with the park plants, etc. The drivers who were being inconvenienced were very unhappy. Lo and behold, fast forward 4 or 5 years, the very same parents are now walking, scootering and cycling to the schools with their children, very happy that the council was bold and brave and carried on with their policies. And the point I'm making in a polite, courteous ways, some of these schemes need to be changed. I get that. Sure. I'm not, but bear with us, because I think this is potential seismic change for the good if we get it right.
So again, I think for the third time this evening, if I've understood you correctly, you are acknowledging the problem that's described by your questioner, but you're saying either that it's a problem that will be overcome or it's a problem that will create its own solution. So perhaps pollution has gone up on some of the roads that have been referred to, perhaps even in Ella's old neck of the woods. But these schemes are designed to get people out of cars, and so when people don't drive on these bottleneck roads, the bottlenecks shrink and the pollution comes down. Let's go to Shirley Rodriguez. Is that the calculation, Shirley?
Hi. Yes, it is, because we've got evidence of this from when we brought in the Central London ultra-low emission zone, and that reduced the number of polluting vehicles seen in the Central London ULEZ area. But by around 44,000 vehicles, and TfL did the monitoring, and there was no displacement of air pollution. So we have very strong evidence that when we expand the ultra-low emission zone in October this year, it's unlikely, we're likely to see the same impact. And I think, from what Sadiq was saying, the LTNs are one element of the armory we have in tackling air pollution, and they're actually a very long-standing tool. I live in an area where there is essentially an LTN where somebody's just blocked off part of a road and it stops the rat running through, and it creates a nice environment, clean environment. But it's not the only thing. As I said, it's part of a tool alongside things like cleaning up our bus fleet. Sadiq and I were at Perivale, where we saw the first 20 hydrogen buses, double-decker buses in London, which are absolutely fantastic, joining, a fleet of now 500 hydrogen electric buses, cleaning up the air in London. And those will affect the main roads. And, ultimately, those main roads are for the main traffic. We don't have enough space for everybody to drive a car. We know that most people in London, Heidi was talking about that earlier, don't own a car. And the ones that do, what we want is to make sure that obviously if you have an essential journey, fine, but try and use your vehicles less and use our fantastic public transport. When the LTNs were brought in, the ones that people are talking about, Marissa, this was because of the pandemic. We were told, social distance on public transport, which meant there wasn't enough capacity, so you had to use, walking, cycling. So we had to make space, which is why those experimental LTNs were brought in. Now local authorities are looking at them, are consulting on whether, to keep them, and that's consulting, Londoners and businesses, and they have to listen and mitigate the concern. So this is exactly the process that's going on at the moment, including down in Lewisham.
So you've got two problems then, if I've understood you correctly. The first is that in order to judge the success of these schemes, ideally you'd need to hop in a time machine and go 5 years down the road and then have a look at whether they've worked or not, whether things have settled down, whether people are actually happier with what's transpired. And the other, perhaps, and this might be a bit of a professional concern for phone-in hosts, the people who don't have cars are not really going to be expressing their views about changes to motoring-based issues. So the only voices you hear generally in these conversations are the voices of motorists who are resistant to any sort of change.
Well, I think Sadiq talked about this earlier. You do hear the people who shout loudest, and so part of our job is to listen to everybody's concerns. And we have many organisations that are coming to us and saying, "Don't forget, these streets aren't just for motorists. They're there for pedestrians, for people with buggies, people who just want to walk, people who want to cycle. We now have businesses who say, well, actually, that space that has been reclaimed, it's been fantastic. It's boosting our economy. People are coming into shops now that weren't, spending time in their local area, understanding actually for the first time what's on offer in these local areas. So that's really the job, the balance I think that Sadiq was talking about, that we have to bring to this issue.
I hadn't thought of it like that before. Regular listeners to my programme will know I'm allergic to motoring related phone-ins at the best of times, but perhaps the answer is to find a way of conducting them in a way that allows the voices of pedestrians and cyclists and non-motorists to be heard more, and then, God forbid, we might get a broader and more realistic reflection of the reality. Let's go to Greenwich next. Alex is there. Alex, what would you like to ask Sadiq Khan?
Hi. I'd like to ask, if the Mayor is committed to improving air quality, how can he justify the planned Silvertown tunnel when it's widely evidenced that more roads ultimately lead to more volume? Health professionals in the area have called it an assault on the health of families, and university studies have stated that it's not compatible with GLA's net zero goal. Surely it's time to look at different options.
Well, we're going to have to agree to disagree, because my experience of that part of London is the Blackwall Tunnel, which is the basic only way to get across the river from one side to the other. We've not got enough river crossings in that part of London. On an average year, Blackwall Tunnel closes between 600 and 700 times a year. A 5-minute closure leads to a 3-mile tailback. Even during the pandemic, the Blackwall Tunnel, I checked this morning, has been closed on more than 520 occasions, leading to congestion, poor quality air, and the most unreliable bus in London is the 108. Why is it the most unreliable? Because it uses the Blackwall Tunnel. So what we're proposing is to have a new tunnel, which will have a lane reserved for double-decker buses, more than 30 double-decker buses going through each way per hour, free pedestrian crossing from one side to the other, and free cyclists going from one side to the other. It will be tolled, as will the Blackwall tunnel, but also the expansion of the ultra-emission zone will include both the Silvertown tunnel and the Blackwall tunnel. So your assertion that will lead to poor quality air and so forth isn't borne out by the evidence. There's been lots of consultation. There's been a development consult order. There's been a public inspector looking into this. So we really have, forgive the pun, kicked the tyres. But this is the way to reduce congestion and improve the quality of air in that part of London.
We can't go back to questioners tonight. We're very tight for time. But Alex, if you want to come on the next, speak to Sadiq and challenge the answer you've received, then I'll make you more than welcome. What I can do, though, is again try to... Is this a utilitarian decision, then? Because you can't be arguing that people who live in the area where the Silvertown tunnel is going to be, that they are going to have a negative impact. But the utilitarian calculation is that things are going to improve in the area of the Blackwall tunnel so much that the overall improvement is what you're aiming for. But the Silvertown tunnel is the price?
No, they'll benefit. There is no way for them to get from one side of the river to the other using public transport. The 108 bus is deeply unreliable.
Yeah, they'll benefit in the context of their transport, but not in the context of their homes.
No, the quality of air will improve, which is a benefit to them.
How can it improve if there's more traffic going down there, Nick?
Because it's not stuck in traffic with a 3-mile tailback 700 times a year.
Right.
And so it's going through smoother. But don't forget, because of the ultra-low emission zone, the vehicles won't be emitting the same amount of nitrogen oxide, particulate matter, or carbon.
Okay. I mean that, Alex. Do take me up on that offer. We'll get you back on the big show. Alina is in Tower Hamlets, and she would like to know why we still have an airport in East London, which is incredibly densely populated, and she wonders whether there are any plans to close it.
Alina, I don't own City Airport. City Airport have had big problems in relation to the pandemic. We'll have to wait and see how...
What do you mean big problems?
Fewer planes coming in,
okay.
and so obviously they make money by the planes coming in.
Okay.
They've been less busy, a bit like TfL, a bit like most businesses across our city for the last 15 months. We don't support plans to expand the City London Airport, which is the plans they had before the pandemic arose, Alina. I suspect, like Heathrow Airport, which is obviously you're comparing a watermelon with a grape, but like Heathrow, they may pause any plans they had for expansion, because I think airports and aviation is having to reconfigure what their future is. We are, though, committed to Canary Wharf, City of London and the West End being rejuvenated and bringing people back. And so we'll have to wait and see where City of London Airport fits into that.
Briefly, if you would, drivers' attitudes to cyclists. Finadini and Newham is troubled. A lot of cyclists are. Listen, a lot of cyclists are pretty obnoxious towards drivers as well, but if you're going to be encouraging more and more people to get onto bicycles, what are you going to do to encourage drivers to be nicer to them?
Well, I think there are a small minority of cyclists who don't follow the rules, just like there are a small minority of drivers who don't follow the rules.
Small minority of politicians,
and dare I say it, broadcasters. And making sweeping generalisations, I think, is unfair. But I think the person is right. We've got to make sure that cyclists understand the highway code, to obey red lights, and to move around in a safe way to them and to others. Caroline explained her concern as a pedestrian with cyclists and e-scooters. And I think what we've got to do is make sure that drivers as well understand that sometimes, because of blind spots, because of junctions that aren't as safe as they should be, and we're making improvements, sometimes they cause real anxiety and sometimes risk to cyclists' personal safety by the way they behave.
8:35 is the time. You're listening to the State of London debate with me, James O'Brien, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and 9 deputy mayors, of whom, and I warned you this was going to happen, we have currently only heard from 4. So 5, if you can squeeze 5, you can find a little hit for 5 of your deputies in the course of the next 25 minutes. Let's go to Sumit, who is in Hillingdon. We're moving on to the vexed question of housing. Again, one of the hardy perennials of national and local politics. Sumit, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Yeah. So as the stamp duty holiday comes to an end, it is likely that the booming housing market will slow down. This really won't be good for the housing market as well as for London's economy, and more so as many people look towards outer London areas for larger spaces in light of extended work from home situations. This means that the already low demand for houses in central London areas, including, say, Zone 1 and 2, may suffer once the stamp duty holiday ends. So what are the mayor's plans to keep the housing space hot in general in London?
Yeah, good question. I'll bring in Tom Copley, the Deputy Mayor for Housing, in literally 10 seconds. But the issue for me isn't demand. I think demand's going to be there. The issue is supply, increasing the supply of the homes Londoners need, rather than luxury penthouse flats bought by foreigners to invest in our city as gold bricks. But I'll let Tom answer to allow him to come in. Tom.
Yes, thank you, and thank you for the question, Sumit. Look, I mean, whether the housing market in London is booming or not booming, hundreds of thousands of Londoners are in housing need. You know, people living in the insecure private rented sector, people living in temporary accommodation, which are far too many now, is not so temporary. People on a waiting list for a social home, people who are overcrowded, and that's why one of Sadiq's top priorities has been delivering genuinely affordable homes. And in 2019-20, we delivered more than 17,000 affordable housing starts in London, which is a record. And even in the midst of the pandemic last year, more than 13,000 starts. And crucially, this includes thousands of new homes for social rent. Sadiq has just talked about delivering the kind of homes that London and Londoners need. The greatest need for housing in London is homes for social rent, and particularly council housing. And every so often, Sadiq and I get to go and meet some of the people who have moved into these new council homes, and it is always an incredible experience. Some of these people have been the people who've been living in temporary accommodation, sometimes for 10 years. Sometimes it's the first time, certainly in several years, that their children have had their own bedroom. It really brings home the importance of dealing with the housing crisis. And we want to do a lot more. We have ambition to do a lot more. But in order to do a lot more, we need the government to give us more funding for affordable housing.
I mean, the question was what your plans are to keep the housing space hot, to keep this booming housing market turning over, particularly in the context of the stamp duty holiday coming to an end. You're, again, reading between the lines of your answer, Tom, you're saying that's actually not a priority for you.
Well, look, stamp duty is a matter for the government.
Keeping the housing space hot is not a priority.
But what we need is investment in affordable housing.
Yeah.
Look, for many years, particularly since 2010, the government's housing policy has essentially been one of cross-subsidy from private sale. Now, that doesn't work hugely well even during the good years, but if we have a recession coming down the line, it completely falls apart. That's why what we need is investment from the government in genuinely affordable housing. We need £4.9 billion a year for the next 10 years in London if we're going to deliver at the scale that we need to. We've only got from the government for the next 5 years, £4 billion. Now, we're going to do a lot with that £4 billion, but we need a lot more because we can't just be relying on cross-subsidy from private sales.
I suppose that question about people moving out of London as well isn't really your concern, is it, being the Mayor of London?
No, it's a big concern. We want to attract talent to London, but also we want to attract people to London, to live in London, who are essential for our city: the porters, the cleaners, the bus drivers, the tube drivers, the nurses, the doctors, the police officers, the teachers. And that's why Tom's spot on. Our priority's got to be genuinely affordable homes for London and diversify the housing markets. There's private sale housing, very important, as the questioner said, but also intermediate housing, council housing, and genuinely affordable housing with a London living rent.
So most coverage and conversation about the housing market is a top-down phenomenon, isn't it? Whereas, again, if I've understood you two correctly, you see it more as a bottom-up.
Spot on.
So it's a category error of sorts.
Spot on. And also, in the short to medium term, James, the reality is there will still be people renting in London privately, so we've got to fix the private rental market, and the best way to do that is to give us the powers to bring in rent controls to regulate better the private rental market. There are, I think, 2 million Londoners currently living in private rental accommodation with no security of tenure, and the rent's going up on a regular basis.
Well, that I mean, you're not going to be able to do that without Westminster.
Yeah, the good news is in the last 5 years we've persuaded Westminster to remove the fees tenants pay to letting agents. We've managed to persuade Westminster to promise to remove Section 21 no-fault eviction, and we're going to try and, as part of my Building Bridges courtship, James, persuade the government why they should give us powers around rent control.
8:41 is the time. Let's go to Natalie, who is in Tower Hamlets. Natalie, what would you like to ask this evening? Hello.
Good evening. Hi, Mayor. I'd like to ask, 4 years after Grenfell,
There are still 176 high-rise buildings in London yet to have the Grenfell-style cladding removed, 870 buildings in London with a waking watch, and countless more, an estimated up to 1.3 million homes nationally, now impacted by the changes introduced with the Fire Safety Bill. The interim costs for waking watch and skyrocketing service charges and insurance premiums are financially crippling, not to mention the mental stress of being forced to live in flammable death traps. News of this national scandal is spreading across the world. The Olympic 2012 legacy tainted by this shameful scandal, and still the London victims of this scandal suffer. What will the mayor do to help his distraught and long-suffering constituents?
This is an unbelievable situation, which, I mean, various promises had been made about fixing it that haven't been kept. To be clear, before you answer some of the detail in Natalie's question, it's an argument about who's going to pay for it. The developers don't want to pay for it, the government won't pay for it, you can't or won't pay for it, and the residents look like they are going to be left with bills, in some cases, bills that end up being higher than the cost of their actual home.
We've got a solution. Tom and I have worked on a solution which the government appeared to be taken on board, which is a levy on the profits made by the developers over the last 10 years, which some developers have signed up to. Tom has more details. If they just paid 10% of their profits, that would be billions of pounds that could contribute towards remediating the buildings that Natalie's talking about. And just to remind some of those listeners not aware, there are leaseholders whose dreams came true to buy a home, and those homes are now albatrosses because they can't sell them, with various requirements around EWS1, around paying for waking watches, and so forth and so forth. So what we're saying to the government is, you pay for the works urgently, and then later on get the monies back, recoup them through this levy from the owners, the developers who've made a fortune, and many of them now saying, listen, we're happy to pay 10%. And so this is one way to sort this out. Tom can mention some of the ones who've some gone on record and said we're willing to pay this in relation to that. And so the government can quite easily legislate in relation to if there's not voluntary scheme from the developers. And what we're saying is the windfall from the profits over the last 10 years, just a small fraction, 10%.
But they will have already been divvied up for shareholders, wouldn't they? Tom Coplig, you can come in here if you want. Can you name any companies that have signed up for this?
When we announced the developer levy, I mean, certainly the Home Builders Federation, which is the body that represents builders, was relatively, I think, receptive to the idea. I think a lot of developers recognise that they have a responsibility here, and it was a collective and systemic failing. It was the developers, and of course, it was the government too. It was a regulatory system, but I can tell you who it wasn't. It wasn't the leaseholders, the people who in good faith bought these flats and who should be protected from the cost of remediation.
What, I mean, listen, I'm a simple soul. Why can't you just tell developers in London that they can't throw up another building until they've taken all the cladding off the ones they've already built? Either of you.
So in relation to the new builds, so in relation to the stuff that we're building or funding, we've made sure none of the dodgy cladding is being used.
That's not what I asked. Just tell them now. You can't, you know, big development on, I won't name names because I'm not fully across the facts, but some big development names that have still got huge new projects underway as we speak also have buildings covered in cladding whose residents are currently having a nightmare. Just tell them to down tools until they've taken the cladding off the buildings they've already built. You can have that for nothing.
We are using the bully pulpit to do what we're allowed to do legally, and using all the levers we have. Similarly, to give the government credit on this point, working with the government where it's possible to do so to put pressure on those developers.
Okay, so, I mean, imagine how that feels. You've got a 90, I mean, not so much in London, you've got, so, but 250 grand flat, and you've got a 100 grand bill for getting the cladding off it, and you're driving up, you know, Acacia Avenue, and you see the same name of the same developer plastered all over some fantastic new multi.
You're also paying each month for a waking watch.
Of course you are.
And for the fire alarm, and for the ground rent.
So the law would prevent you from my somewhat simplistic suggestion.
Well, we don't want litigation, but you know, Tom has met with some of these developers. I've written to the government's engaged with them as well, and we're hoping to make progress. But it's no consolation to Natalie in relation to 4 years of misery, but also it's 4 years on from Grenfell, and it's still the case that too many buildings in London, the fire service won't have confidence that the stay put advice is working because the built environment is dangerous.
So in terms of light at the end of the tunnel, it's still very, very far away for people. Natalie didn't actually establish whether or not she is in this position, but one presumes she is.
For some in buildings above 18 metres, where there's dodgy cladding, there's good news for them because the government has given money for them. For those who live in buildings less than 18 metres, where the safety concerns aren't the cladding, I'm afraid there's no light at the end of the tunnel yet.
Kevin is a man after my own heart. He wants to know what sort of powers you have to compel companies or individuals that own empty properties. This was around a while ago, wasn't it? I remember this story. Even after Grenfell, there were suggestions that empty properties would be kind of co-opted to put some of the dispossessed families into. What can you do with that? But commercial properties as well, which could be converted into residential, and you could free them up for people who need a roof over their head at an affordable price.
So, Kevin, we've got no powers to take any action directly. What we have been doing is lobbying the government to give councils more powers to charge them big council tax bills if their building's empty, but also we're supporting, and Tom's been working with councils to give councils money to buy back properties sold under the right to buy when they become surplus to the requirements of the people that bought it. But the bad news, Kevin, is we're not allowed to, we've got no powers, let alone the resources to buy back empty buildings. What James is alluding to is you'll be where there were large numbers of families who were homeless because of the Grenfell Tower fire, who weren't being rehoused, many in temporary accommodation, sofa surfing in hostels, and yet there were large numbers of empty properties that could have been used to rehouse them. And that's where the conversation came to the fore, because of the fact that there were properties that could be used by these families that weren't being used. And we were lobbying central government to use the powers that they had to procure these empty buildings to be used by these families.
I'm quite close to some of the people affected most profoundly by Grenfell, and they worry that this issue is not going to be properly addressed or indeed properly understood until there is another tragedy. And some of them who, I think it's fair to say, predicted the Grenfell Tower tragedy, predict another one.
Well, I also meet with them regularly, and it's 4 years on now. But I think they're right to be concerned. I'll tell you why. One of the things that the families were concerned about was once the caravan moves on, the government caravan, the media caravan,
the spotlight,
they'll go at the fore, and that's one of the reasons, by the way. There is a real nervousness about the tower coming down. You'll have heard the comments from the government about the safety of the tower and it coming down, and the worry is out of sight, out of mind. And so we're working with the families, next of kin, Grenfell United, many other families, many members of the community, to do what we can to be their advocate and champion. And the other concern that they have is we're currently in phase 2 of the inquiry. Once the inquiry's over, there'll be no discussion at all about Grenfell Tower, notwithstanding what Natalie said about how she's suffering as well. So these are issues that we raise regularly with the families on their behalf with the government to get some pressure and some urgency around a really important issue.
We move now on to the final topic of the evening. I would stress that the Mayor of London joins me on LBC every month for the Speak to Sadiq programme. So if there is anything you'd like to pick him up on specifically, or indeed any of the deputies that we've heard from so far, then do feel free to get in touch on that programme. I often wonder whether you really believe me when I say that you can ring in and ask whatever you want, but trust me, you really can. So now London's economic recovery, or perhaps I should insert hoped for economic recovery, because that's a very steep hill that we all have to climb, but it's your job. For the rest of us, it's I suppose it's our lives, and that is an issue to which Vitor in Tower Hamlets wants to speak. Vitor, what would you like to ask the Mayor?
Hi, hello, good evening. So you kept saying that London is open for business, especially during the Brexit transition period. But after this time, and with all the constraints and pandemic issues, where people and talent can work from home or remotely, how do you plan to attract that European talent to work in London again?
Well, Vitor, with James's permission, I'm bringing Rajesh Agrawal, my Deputy Mayor for Business, to answer this question and talk through some of the plans we have to bring people back to London, not just those Londoners who may have returned to country of origin, but particularly to really get retail, hospitality and culture going over the next few weeks and months. Rajesh,
can you begin by telling us how bad it is? How big are these holes in these sectors that need to be filled with humans, with workers?
It is a very difficult time, and I can tell you as an entrepreneur, it takes blood, sweat and tears to build a business. it's many years of hard work, and a lot of these businesses are really struggling with no fault of their own. We have stood shoulder to shoulder to these businesses, supported them throughout the pandemic, and became.
We're short of time, Rajesh. What are you going to do moving forward? What are you going to do to get people here?
Well, since we are short of time, let me talk about Let's Do London campaign, which is the biggest in-country tourism campaign London has ever done to support our recovery. So I want to say to listeners who are from outside London, this summer, do come to London and visit some of our amazing museums, art galleries, restaurants, shows, and more. Do the zoo. Do some shopping, kick off your Zoom slippers and try on some new shoes. Do take a bus, made in Yorkshire, by the way, and sit on top deck to admire the view of Thames. And
what if all these places what if they're all shut because they haven't got the staff? That's really what Vitor is asking about. How are we going to get workers back into the city?
And exactly for that reason. So on top of our annual skills budget of £330 million, we have put a £32 million budget exactly to target the sectors which have been hard hit by the pandemic, reskilling the people, and you try and get them in the jobs where they are needed the most. And, it's a double whammy of COVID and Brexit, which has created a shortage of staff in some of these sectors.
James, can I just say one thing whilst we were talking about Vitor and some of the other callers we've had? Just remind your listeners, 30th of June is the deadline for Londoners and others across the country who are EU citizens to apply for their settled status. And if they don't apply by that date, some of the safeguards they have in relation to employment, being a tenant, receiving public services will be lost. And so I'd encourage all of your listeners to speak to their families, friends, neighbours, work colleagues to make sure they apply by next week.
How big a problem do you think this is, sort of away from the statistics and the numbers? Because I worry that it's all very well, even if you were managing, sectors, as you will both know, are queuing up for exemptions now, begging for exemptions. HGV drivers, I think, 70-odd thousand shortages. We already know about the numbers in the NHS, the hospitality sector. We're already hearing about businesses that can't reopen as much as they want to because they haven't got the bodies to do the shifts. So, and I don't think anyone's going to be surprised by my views on Brexit, but if you did even secure these exemptions, it's a very different sort of welcome from the one that people enjoyed before. You can come over here and do the job, but don't think that you'll be making a home here.
Well, let's be frank. We're competing against other great European cities who will give them proper rights, proper security in their residency. Why would you choose, if you're coming from a town in southern Poland, London versus Berlin or Madrid or Barcelona or Dublin, where you're part of the EU family? And we've got to recognise that.
Yeah.
What we're doing to replace that, we can't go backwards, is to talk up the strengths we have, notwithstanding that, which is our ecosystem. The best universities, life sciences, culture, creative industries, tech, the fact that we've got museums, galleries and so forth. And we as Londoners have got to make sure we try even harder to show that we're open, inclusive, pluralistic. London is open should be not just a three-word phrase, but it should mean something about our values.
This has never occurred to me before this evening, actually. And I don't know what the rubric is, what the small print says, but I know that if you're in Dubai, for example, and you lose your job, you get slung out of the country more or less immediately. If people come here from other European Union countries and fall below whatever the threshold is that they need to reach to qualify, do you foresee something similar happening in the United Kingdom to what happens in the United Arab Emirates?
Well, there is a similarity in relation to those who come on a work visa.
Yeah.
So the work visa is normally attached to the employer. Under the point system, it's a bit different on the EU point system, which is the points you get is because of the job you're doing. And so the concern we have isn't so much the person losing their status because they lost their job. It's making sure the government realises some jobs may not, in their eyes, be high skilled in terms of points, but we need them. Hospitality, retail, culture are the best examples.
But if they then get ill?
Big issue.
Do we know yet? I mean, do you know?
No,
You're the Mayor of London.
You still get you're still entitled to some benefits.
But if you could never work again, are you going to get slung out of the country?
Well,
perhaps you come here to work in a high risk job like the building trade,
the best way to answer that is you will not get the same rights in London as you would in Berlin, Madrid, Paris, Barcelona, and so forth. And that's why it's really important for us to be aware of the fact that our competitors have a huge advantage over us?
We're very, very short of time. So Chanley and Bexley, I apologise for the fact that you won't get a very long answer to your question, but I'm delighted that you're about to ask it.
Hi there, thank you for having me. So my question centres around unconscious bias, which is
Oh, and there we go. I mean, it was bound to happen. It seems to be quite the fashion in the media at the moment. Chanley, something's gone wrong with your line. So if I have to, I'll ask the question myself. But before we take a view on that, I just want to go back to this London is open issue or the new scheme to tempt tourists here. Andrew Lloyd Webber is taking legal action to force the government to hand over the results of its live event pilot scheme. This was the scheme that was expected to see test events like the Download Brit Awards last week, allowing event planners to look ahead for the rest of the summer. But publication has been delayed without explanation. Do you know why?
No.
Do you support the legal action?
I do. I think sunlight is the best disinfectant.
So do you want to speculate on why they would have kept this from the people?
I suspect it could be because the government may be nervous that actually there weren't good reasons not to allow events to have more people going to the events than is currently allowed. And I think all Lloyd Webber, Sonia Friedman and the others are seeking to do is just to see the evidence. It's unclear, and it is inexplicable why you wouldn't share the evidence.
Chanley was going to ask what you're going to do to protect people in the workplace from overt or unconscious racial bias, and she wants to know whether your office would get involved in mandatory unconscious bias training, at least for those in senior leadership roles.
No, cracking question. So we do in the functional bodies that I'm in charge of, Chanley. So what we're doing is, not just in City Hall since I've been elected mayor, TfL, Met Police Service, the Fire Service, the development corporations, make sure that we have anti-discrimination policies and proper training, not just unconscious bias, but bias training. But also, Chanley, you'll be pleased to know, even though we've got no direct powers, we've also set up something called the Good Work Standard. It's like a quality kite mark, James, where basically good employers can apply to be a Good Work Standard employer, and a lot of that addresses some of the concerns that many have about people not doing as well because of their gender, their ethnicity, their religion, disability, age, sexuality, and so forth. I've also, Chanley, in the interest of transparency, published the grades of people who work for me based upon ethnicity, gender, disability, and so forth. There were big gaps, I'm afraid, when I first became mayor. For gender, we've managed to close the gap. It's almost zero. I think it may be zero. For ethnicity, there's still a gap. We're narrowing the gap.
Doing better than Buckingham Palace, then?
Well, I mean, progress is progress, and it's not for me to comment on.
It's not like you.
But yeah, the numbers aren't great. But to be fair, they've acknowledged that.
They have, absolutely.
You've got to measure it, and then have transparency, then have an action plan to address that. But it's a really important issue.
We're out of time. I don't know how you're going to square this tomorrow with the 3 deputy mayors who we haven't heard from.
Oh, it's simple, James. I'm going to blame you.
Okay, you can hardly blame me. I spent the entire evening reminding you how important it was to make sure that the likes of Joanne McCartney, Jules Pipe, and Justine Simons would be able to contribute to
the best three you didn't call.
May I apologise to you 3 on behalf of your boss? I don't know what it is you've done, whether you've kind of nicked his milk out of the fridge or something like that, but I don't know why he hasn't brought you into proceedings this evening. I'll let you deal with that in tomorrow morning's staff meeting. And I'm happy to be called as a witness to any future HR events
he's a hostile witness, yeah?
You have been listening to the State of London debate, the State of London Inquisition, with me, James O'Brien, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and the various deputy mayors. Up next on LBC, it's Ian Dale with the inimitable Denise Headley.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
Leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Spain's Balearic Islands, Malta, Madeira and some islands in the Caribbean, including Barbados, have been added to the green COVID travel list. It means people